The broadcast began as a celebration. Across the galaxy, billions tuned in expecting spectacle, diplomacy, and power theater. The kind of stage dominance displays ancient empires used to remind younger species where they stood. The camera drifted through a pristine human habitat, sunlight spilling across artificial oceans, children laughing in low-gravity gardens, diplomats walking polished corridors as if nothing in the universe could possibly go wrong. Then the first explosion happened. It didn't shatter the station. It erased part of it. A section of the habitat simply vanished, leaving behind a perfect absence where structure, air, and life had existed a moment before. There was no fire, no debris, no chaos. Just a clean, impossible void that swallowed everything without resistance. For a few seconds, no one reacted. Not the viewers, not the observers, not even the victims, because nothing like this had ever been seen before. Then the second strike came, slower this time, deliberate, the camera zooming in as another segment of the station disappeared in absolute silence. People ran now, tiny figures scrambling across transparent walkways as entire sections of reality were peeled away around them like layers of a simulation being deleted. And then the voice arrived, cold, amused, certain. "This," it said, echoing across every communication channel in the galaxy, "is what happens when lesser species forget their place." The realization hit all at once. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an attack meant to conquer. It was a performance. The feed split into multiple angles, showing terrified civilians from every perspective. Families separated mid-motion. Emergency crews frozen between action and oblivion. Entire districts dissolving into nothing while the attackers narrated each moment like a demonstration. They weren't hiding it. They wanted everyone to see. Inside the collapsing habitat, a single human official forced their way into a failing broadcast node, blood running down their face. Their breathing uneven, but their voice steady. Too steady. "If you're watching this," they said, eyes locking onto the camera as the structure behind them began to unravel, "then understand something very carefully." Another section of the station vanished, close enough that the light shifted across their face. Still, they didn't look away. "You think this makes you strong." A pause. It wasn't fear in their expression. It wasn't even anger. It was something far more dangerous. "You think this makes you untouchable." The transmission flickered, the signal degrading as systems failed around them. But the voice held, clear enough for every listener across the galaxy to hear what came next. "It doesn't." For the first time, the attacking voice interrupted, amused. "And what exactly will you do about it?" it asked, the tone almost curious. The human didn't hesitate, didn't shout, didn't threaten. They simply answered, "You've just shown us something we didn't know before." The station behind them began to collapse inward, the void expanding, the edges of reality folding toward the center. "And what is that?" the alien voice asked. The human smiled, not with hope, not with defiance, with certainty that you're willing to be remembered. The feed cut to black. No final explosion, no last scream, just absence. Across the galaxy, silence followed. Not outrage, not immediate retaliation. Silence. Hours passed, then days. No fleets launched, no declarations were made, no messages were sent. Earth did nothing, at least, nothing anyone could see. But in the deepest monitoring networks, in the systems that tracked movement beyond politics and beyond perception, something began to change. Trade routes shifted, signals went dark, entire sectors of human activity disappeared from the map, not destroyed, removed. And the species that had just performed the most public massacre in galactic history, they celebrated. They believed the silence meant victory. They believed fear had worked. They believed humanity had been broken. But there was one problem. In every recorded war, in every known conflict, In every documented history of human behavior, silence had never meant surrender. It had always meant preparation. And somewhere, far from the eyes of the galaxy, the question no one could yet answer was already taking shape. What exactly had humanity just started building? The silence did not spread like grief. It spread like control. Across human space, the expected signals of mourning never came. There were no mass broadcasts, no unified calls for justice, no desperate appeals to allies or cries for intervention. Entire worlds remained lit, functioning, populated, but their public channels went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not broken. It wasn't the chaos of a wounded species. It was the stillness of one deciding something. At first, the galaxy interpreted it as shock, then denial, then weakness, because that was what every empire had done before they collapsed, hesitated, fragmented, argued, and eventually disappeared. Analysts across multiple species produced identical conclusions. Humanity lacked the internal cohesion to respond. Their diversity, their decentralized governance, their constant internal disagreements, these were weaknesses, not strengths. The attackers repeated those conclusions publicly. They replayed the broadcast, again and again, each time adding commentary, each time amplifying the humiliation, each time reinforcing the same narrative, that humanity had been shown its place and would remain there. No response came, not from Earth, not from any human authority, and that was when the first anomaly appeared. It wasn't military. It wasn't even obvious. A minor shipping route in a peripheral sector rerouted itself without explanation, bypassing 3 major trade hubs that had operated without interruption for decades. The change didn't trigger alarms, didn't disrupt supply chains in any noticeable way, but it was inefficient, deliberately so. An independent observer flagged it, then dismissed it, until it happened again and again. Across multiple sectors, human logistics began to shift, not toward optimization, not toward profit, but toward something harder to define. Routes lengthened, timelines expanded, redundancies appeared where none had existed before. It looked, at first glance, like a system degrading, until someone realized it was doing the opposite. It was distributing resources, personnel, infrastructure. Everything began to spread outward in patterns that avoided centralization. Key industries fractured into smaller, less visible nodes. Manufacturing chains broke apart, then reassembled in ways that made tracking production nearly impossible. Human space wasn't collapsing. It was dissolving its own structure. The first to notice the pattern clearly was not a general or a politician, but a junior analyst assigned to monitoring low-priority economic fluctuations. They weren't looking for war preparations. They were looking for instability. What they found was something else entirely. Consistency, not in output. In intent, every deviation followed the same principle. Reduce visibility, increase resilience, remove single points of failure. It was the kind of systemic redesign that took decades to plan, and it was happening in real time. The analyst escalated the findings. Their superiors reviewed the data. Then they dismissed it, because there was still no visible military response. No fleet mobilizations. No weapons production spikes. No signs of retaliation. Humanity, on the surface, was still doing nothing. But beneath that surface, something else was emerging. Communication patterns changed next. Not the content, the structure. Messages between human systems began to fragment, breaking into smaller packets that traveled through indirect routes, recombining only at their destination. Encryption levels rose, but more importantly, the pathways themselves became unpredictable, constantly shifting, never repeating. It wasn't just secure, it was untraceable. Across the galaxy, intelligence networks attempted to map the changes, to find the center of coordination, the command authority driving the transformation. They found nothing, because there was no center. Human decision-making began to appear everywhere and nowhere at once, actions taken without clear origin, systems adjusting without visible leadership. It was as if the entire species had agreed on something without ever saying it out loud. And still, there was no response. The attackers grew bolder. They expanded their broadcasts, pushing deeper into human territory, daring a reaction that never came. They expected anger, retaliation, at least a defensive posture. Instead, they found absence. Human border systems began to thin, not collapsing, but withdrawing, leaving behind regions that appeared abandoned. Stations powered down, outposts went dark, entire sectors emptied of visible activity. To the attackers, it looked like retreat. To the analyst, it looked like something else. Preparation, because every abandoned system shared one characteristic. It had already been stripped of anything essential. Resources removed, data wiped, infrastructure dismantled or repurposed. Nothing of value remained. Humanity wasn't losing territory. It was choosing what not to defend. The realization came slowly, piece by piece, until it formed a question that refused to go away. If humans weren't protecting their space, then where were they focusing? The answer didn't appear in military reports. It appeared in silence, a complete, absolute absence of human presence in regions that should have been active. Deep space zones, unmonitored corridors, areas too remote to matter strategically. Except now, they did, because that was where the signals were going. Faint at first, almost undetectable, then growing. Not broadcasts, not communications, construction. The analyst stared at the data, the pattern finally resolving into something undeniable, something that sent a chill through every layer of their understanding. Humanity wasn't preparing to respond to the attack. It was building something new, something hidden, something large enough to require the disappearance of entire sectors. And for the first time since the broadcast, a different kind of fear began to spread, not of what had been done to humanity, but of what humanity was choosing to do next. Because if this was not retaliation, then why did it feel like something far worse was coming? The first mistake the galaxy made was assuming time was on their side. The second was assuming humanity needed to be visible to be dangerous. Weeks passed after the massacre, and the silence held. But now it carried weight. Not the empty quiet of defeat, but the oppressive stillness of something unfolding just out of sight. Systems that once pulsed with human activity continued to dim, one by one, like stars being carefully switched off rather than destroyed. And still no fleet moved. That was what made it unbearable. Because every empire understood war. They understood escalation, retaliation, defense. War followed patterns, even at its most brutal. You could prepare for it. You could predict it. But this was absence with intent. The young analyst who had first noticed the irregularities was no longer looking at trade routes. Their access had expanded, reluctantly granted, after too many anomalies refused to resolve. Now they were watching something far more unsettling. Data that didn't just shift, but disappeared. Entire datasets, civilian registries, industrial outputs, navigation records, were being erased or fragmented beyond recovery. Not hacked, not stolen, removed. At first, it appeared chaotic, as if humanity was collapsing under its own weight. But then the patterns surfaced again, colder and more precise than before. Nothing critical was actually lost. Every removed dataset had already been duplicated, rerouted, or integrated elsewhere before deletion. The erasure wasn't damage. It was concealment. Why hide everything? The analyst muttered, staring at the cascading gaps in what had once been a fully mapped civilization. Because hiding meant one thing. You didn't want to be found. But by whom? The answer came sooner than expected. At the edge of monitored space, a remote listening array picked up something unusual. Not a signal, not a transmission, but a distortion in background noise. A slight inconsistency in the static hum of deep space, subtle enough to ignore unless you knew exactly what to look for. The analyst didn't ignore it. They isolated the anomaly, then expanded the scan. What they found didn't make sense. The distortion wasn't singular. It was layered. Multiple sources, overlapping in frequency and position, scattered across regions that had been marked as inactive, abandoned, or irrelevant, each one faint on its own, but together forming a pattern that stretched far beyond any known human infrastructure. Construction, but not the kind anyone recognized. There were no shipyards, no orbital platforms, no visible structures, just distortions, as if something was being built in a way that didn't interact with conventional matter the way it should. The analyst pushed the data upward again, this time bypassing standard channels, forcing it into military review. This time it wasn't dismissed, but it wasn't understood either. Could it be cloaking? A senior officer suggested. Not at this scale, another replied. You can't hide something that large without energy signatures. There's nothing here, but there was, just not in a form they could define. Meanwhile, the attackers continued their displays. More broadcasts, more provocations. They pushed deeper into what had once been human territory, encountering no resistance, no defense systems, no retaliation. Entire regions lay open before them, stripped bare, silent, and seemingly abandoned. It felt like victory. It looked like surrender. And yet, there were no survivors, no refugees, no scattered human fleets fleeing into unknown space. It was as if the species had simply stepped aside. The first hint that something was wrong came during one of those victory broadcasts. An attacking fleet entered a previously populated sector, cameras active, ready to document another display of dominance. They expected emptiness, confirmation that humanity had retreated completely. Instead, they found something else. Not structures, not ships, a field. At first, it appeared as a faint shimmer against the backdrop of stars, barely perceptible, like heat distortion in vacuum. The fleet slowed, sensors sweeping the region, attempting to classify the anomaly. They found nothing. No mass, no energy signature, no identifiable presence. And then one of their ships drifted too close. It didn't explode. It didn't vanish. It stopped. Mid-motion, every system active, every reading stable, but the ship itself motionless, as if reality had decided it no longer needed to move. The crew inside transmitted confusion, then alarm, then silence. Not because communication failed, but because their words repeated, looped. The same sentences over and over, trapped in a moment that refused to advance. The rest of the fleet pulled back immediately, abandoning the broadcast, cutting the feed before the full extent of the anomaly could be seen. But it was too late. Enough had been captured. Enough had spread. The analyst watched the recording frame by frame, their breathing slowing as the realization took hold. This wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an attack. It was a boundary, and humanity had built it. Across multiple sectors, similar distortions began to appear, subtle at first, then undeniable. Entire regions of space were no longer behaving the way they should. Movement slowed, signals fractured. Time itself seemed to hesitate at the edges of these invisible constructs. The galaxy didn't understand what it was seeing, but it understood one thing. This was not retreat. This was not surrender. This was preparation on a scale no one had imagined. The attackers began to adjust their strategy, pulling back from deeper incursions, redirecting resources toward analysis instead of spectacle. For the first time since the massacre, uncertainty crept into their command structure. "What are they building?" one of their commanders asked, the question echoing across a war room that suddenly felt less certain of its dominance. No one answered, because the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Humanity wasn't preparing to fight a war. It was preparing to change the rules of one. And somewhere beyond those distortions, beyond the silent sectors and erased data, something vast was taking shape, something that did not need to be seen to exist. The analyst leaned back, eyes fixed on the growing pattern, a single thought forming that refused to be dismissed. If this wasn't a defense, then why did it feel like a trap? The moment the attackers stopped celebrating, the balance shifted. It didn't happen publicly. There were no announcements, no reversals of propaganda, no admission of doubt. Their broadcasts continued, their tone remained dominant, and their fleets still moved through abandoned human systems with theatrical confidence. But the pattern of their movement changed. They stopped advancing, not completely, just enough. Their incursions became shorter, more controlled, probing instead of conquering. Ships approached the strange distortion fields, scanned them from a distance, then withdrew before crossing the invisible boundary. The spectacle of dominance gave way to something quieter, something more cautious. For the first time, they were thinking, and that alone was enough to confirm the analyst's fear. The enemy had finally realized something was wrong, but they still didn't understand what. Inside their command structures, theories began to form. Some believed the distortions were experimental human weapons, unpredictable, unstable, not yet ready for full deployment. Others argued they were environmental anomalies triggered by damaged infrastructure. A few, far fewer, suggested something more unsettling, that humanity had found a way to alter the fabric of space itself. Those voices were ignored, because accepting that possibility meant accepting something far worse. That the massacre had not weakened humanity, it had accelerated it. Meanwhile, beyond the range of those probing fleets, the distortions continued to grow. They weren't expanding randomly. They were aligning. From a distance, they formed a pattern too large to perceive from any single vantage point. But when the analyst layered the data, sector by sector, signal by signal, the structure began to emerge. Not a wall, not a barrier, a network. Vast, interconnected, and incomplete. The realization hit like a delayed shock. "This isn't defense," the analyst whispered, staring at the map that now stretched across half the known galaxy. "They're not trying to keep something out. They were trying to connect something." The implication changed everything, because if the distortions were nodes in a system, then the empty space between them wasn't empty at all. It was waiting. The data was escalated again, this time bypassing every layer of bureaucracy. It reached high command, strategic councils, even diplomatic observers who had long since stopped paying attention to human affairs. This time, no one dismissed it, but still, no one understood it. "What does it do?" a senior commander asked, frustration creeping into their voice as they studied the projections. The analyst hesitated, because that was the problem. "We don't know," they admitted, "but it's not random. It's not reactive. It's being built with purpose." "And that purpose is?" the commander pressed. The analyst looked back at the map, at the growing web of distortions, at the way they curved around certain regions and converged toward others. "It's not targeting the attackers," they said slowly. A pause. "It's targeting space itself." Silence followed, not disbelief, but discomfort, because that kind of statement didn't fit into any known doctrine of war. The attackers responded in the only way they knew how. They escalated. A specialized fleet was assembled, equipped not for spectacle, but for analysis and penetration. Their objective was simple: breach one of the distortion fields, identify its function, and neutralize it if possible. This was no longer about dominance. It was about understanding. The chosen target was a mid-range node, isolated enough to minimize risk, but stable enough to provide consistent readings. The fleet approached in formation, sensors active, shields reinforced, every system calibrated for anomaly interaction. As they crossed the boundary, nothing happened. No resistance, no reaction. The distortion field remained passive. Encouraged, the fleet advanced further, deeper into the region where physics itself seemed to hesitate. Then the first inconsistency appeared. A ship reported a delay in its internal systems, fractions of a second at first, barely noticeable, then growing. Another ship experienced a similar lag, but not at the same time, not in the same way. Signals between vessels began to desynchronize, not failing, but arriving out of order. Time itself wasn't breaking. It was losing agreement. "Maintain formation," the fleet commander ordered, their voice steady despite the growing unease. But formation required consistency, and consistency was slipping. Ships began to drift, not physically, but in sequence, actions occurring slightly before or after they should, commands executing out of sync with reality itself. The deeper they moved into the field, the more pronounced the effect became. Then something worse happened. One of the ships fired. No order had been given. No threat had been identified. The weapon discharged anyway, its trajectory correct, its timing perfect, except it had happened before the decision to fire had been made. The crew reported it immediately, confusion turning to alarm. "We didn't initiate that," one officer said. "You did," another replied, their voice overlapping with the first, repeating the same words half a second later. The commander froze, because for a moment, there were two versions of the same action, slightly out of sync, both real, both recorded, and neither fully aligned. "Withdraw," the commander ordered. This time, the fleet obeyed instantly, pulling back from the distortion field, retreating to stable space where time and sequence reasserted themselves. The moment they crossed the boundary, everything snapped back into place. Systems synchronized, signals aligned, reality stabilized. But something had changed. The recordings didn't match. Data logs from different ships showed conflicting timelines, overlapping events, sequences that could not all have occurred in the same order. It wasn't corruption. It was contradiction. The fleet returned with more questions than answers. And one terrifying conclusion. "That wasn't a weapon," the commander reported. A pause. "It was a system that doesn't require agreement." The chamber went silent, because that meant one thing. The distortions weren't meant to destroy. They were meant to remove the rules that made destruction possible. Across the galaxy, the pattern continued to grow, the network expanding, connecting, aligning toward something still unseen. The attackers began to pull back more noticeably now, their confidence replaced by calculation, their dominance by caution. But it was too late, because the realization had already begun to spread. Humanity wasn't preparing to fight the enemy. It was preparing to make the enemy irrelevant. And as the final nodes of the network began to align, forming a structure that no one could fully comprehend, a single question echoed across every command center, every intelligence network, every mind trying to understand what was coming next. If humanity removes the rules of war, what happens to those who only know how to fight? The shift did not begin with an attack. It began with a connection. Across the growing network of distortions, something subtle changed. Not in size, not in intensity, but in behavior. The isolated nodes that had once acted independently, each warping reality, within its own localized boundary, began to synchronize, not through signals, not through energy transfer, through alignment. The analyst saw it first. Patterns that had once appeared chaotic now resolved into something structured, something intentional. The distortions were no longer just interfering with time and sequence. They were beginning to agree with each other. And that was impossible, because the entire point of the system had been to remove agreement, to create contradictions, to make reality itself unreliable for anything trying to impose order. But now, the contradictions were being coordinated. "Zoom out," the analyst whispered, their voice barely audible as the data expanded beyond a single sector, beyond a dozen, beyond anything that could be tracked in isolation. The map changed. For the first time, the full structure became visible. It wasn't a scattered network. It was a shape, a vast, interconnected lattice stretching across human space and far beyond it, each node positioned with mathematical precision, each distortion interacting with the others in ways that could not be explained by known physics. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't even strategic. It was architectural. "They're not building a battlefield," the analyst said, their voice tightening as the realization took hold. A pause. "They're building a different reality." The words hung in the chamber, too large to process immediately, too absurd to dismiss outright. "What does that even mean?" a commander demanded, frustration breaking through the tension. The analyst didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't in the data. It was in what the data implied. If the enemy relies on consistency to define targets, and we remove consistency. They trailed off, the conclusion forming faster than they could speak it. Then nothing they try to destroy can stay defined long enough to be destroyed. Silence, because that wasn't a weapon. That was immunity. The projection shifted again, showing the attacker fleets repositioning at the edge of the expanding network. They had stopped probing directly, their earlier attempt still too poorly understood to risk repetition. Instead, they began to observe, to analyze from a distance, their formations tighter now, their movements more cautious. They were waiting, and for the first time, they were uncertain. The human silence had not been emptiness. It had been construction. But the real twist came seconds later. A section of the network activated. Not violently, not visibly, but undeniably. A region of space, previously marked by one of the distortion nodes, shifted, the stars within it subtly repositioning, their light bending in ways that suggested not just interference, but reconfiguration. Signals passing through the area did not vanish. They changed. Messages sent into the region arrived altered. Not corrupted, not damaged, but reinterpreted, their structure modified in ways that preserved meaning but altered sequence. Cause and effect no longer aligned. The attackers reacted immediately. A long-range strike was launched, targeting the active node with precision weaponry designed to eliminate anything within its coordinates. The strike hit perfectly and did nothing, not because it failed, because the result never stabilized. The impact occurred, recorded, observed, undeniable, and then unraveled. The destruction did not persist long enough to complete. The moment of impact existed, but its consequence did not. It was as if the universe itself had decided not to finalize the event. The chamber froze, because that broke more than physics. It broke certainty. "They're not just disrupting reality," the analyst said, their voice hollow with realization. A pause. "They're refusing to let outcomes exist." The implications spread instantly, because if an outcome could not be fixed, could not be finalized, then it could not be relied upon. And if it could not be relied upon, it could not be used to destroy anything. The attackers adjusted again, faster this time, their fleets repositioning, their formations shifting to account for the new variable. But there was no variable, there was no pattern, because every attempt to observe the system produced a slightly different result. Every measurement contradicted the last. Every prediction failed before it could be tested. "They can't model it," someone said quietly. "No," the analyst replied. "They can't even define it." The realization settled into the chamber with crushing weight. This was no longer a war. It was the removal of war as a concept. But then, as the network continued to align, as more nodes activated and the structure expanded further, another question emerged. more dangerous than the first. If this protects them, the commander said slowly. A pause. What else does it do? The analyst stared at the map, at the growing lattice, at the way it extended beyond human space, reaching toward regions that had never been part of the conflict. And for the first time since the massacre, fear shifted, not toward the attackers, toward humanity, because the network wasn't stopping. It wasn't contained. It was expanding, not as a defense, as a replacement. The thought formed, sharp and undeniable. If humanity could rewrite the rules of reality to protect itself, what happens to everything else when those rules change? The moment the network crossed beyond human space, the galaxy lost the illusion of control. It wasn't announced. No declaration, no warning, no visible boundary marking the transition. One moment, the distortions existed within regions that could still be labeled as human territory. The next, they didn't belong to anyone at all. They spread, not violently, not aggressively, but with absolute certainty. Systems that had never seen a human ship, never traded with Earth, never acknowledged its existence, began to experience the same subtle inconsistencies. Time delays that didn't align, signals arriving out of sequence, physical processes completing without clear cause or lingering without effect. At first, they were dismissed. Localized anomalies, sensor errors, minor fluctuations. Then entire star systems began reporting the same thing, and the reports didn't match, not because they were wrong, because they were all correct in different ways. Inside the central command chambers of the attacking empire, the tone shifted completely. There was no longer any pretense of superiority, no continuation of spectacle. Every resource was redirected toward understanding the phenomenon that was now expanding beyond their influence. "What is it doing?" one of their senior commanders demanded, their voice stripped of arrogance, reduced to urgency. No one answered, because the data refused to stabilize long enough to produce a conclusion. The analyst, watching from a distant observation network, felt the shift more clearly than anyone, because the pattern had finally broken. Up until now, the network had been growing with purpose, node by node, sector by sector, each expansion following a logic that could at least be traced, if not understood. Now, there was no logic. The expansion didn't follow resource availability. It didn't follow strategic value. It didn't even follow proximity. It simply appeared, as if the system no longer needed to build itself, as if it had reached a state where it could define its own existence without physical limitation. "They've crossed the threshold," the analyst whispered, their voice barely steady as they watched the data cascade across every monitored channel. A nearby observer turned to them. "What threshold?" The analyst didn't look away from the projection, the point where it stops being constructed and starts being real. The words sounded absurd, until the next event proved them correct. A major fleet from the attacking empire attempted a coordinated strike across multiple sectors, targeting several active nodes simultaneously. The strategy was sound: overwhelm the system, force it to respond in multiple places at once, identify its limits. The strike was executed perfectly, every weapon fired on time, every trajectory calculated with precision, every impact recorded, and every result failed to agree. In one set of data, the nodes were destroyed. In another, they remained untouched. In a third, the weapons never fired at all. All three outcomes existed simultaneously. None of them could be confirmed as the true result. The fleet returned to base with conflicting reports, their systems unable to reconcile what had actually happened. The commanders reviewed the data, searching for error, for corruption, for any explanation that could restore consistency. They found none, because the system hadn't failed. It had removed the need for a single outcome. The pressure escalated instantly. Across the galaxy, more systems began to destabilize, not through destruction, but through contradiction. Navigation routes became unreliable. Communication networks fractured into overlapping versions of the same message. Even biological processes, in some species, began to show minor inconsistencies. Reactions occurring faster or slower than expected, memories forming with slight variations. The effect was still subtle, but it was growing. "This isn't containment," one of the commanders said, their voice tight with realization. "This is spread." The analysts closed their eyes for a moment, the weight of the conclusion settling fully for the first time. "Yes," they said, "a pause, and it's accelerating." Because the network was no longer bound by human space. It was rewriting the environment itself. The attacking empire made one final decision. If the system could not be understood, it would be eliminated at its source. Coordinates were calculated. A full-scale assault was prepared, not against the nodes, against Earth. The logic was simple. Destroy the origin, collapse the network, restore reality. The fleet assembled faster than any previous mobilization, drawing forces from every sector, every reserve, every hidden armory. This was no longer a demonstration of power. It was survival. As they entered the region once defined as human core space, something unexpected happened. There was nothing there. No fleets, no defenses, no planetary signals. Earth was gone, not destroyed, not hidden, absent. The coordinates still existed, the star still burned, but the system itself felt hollow, as if the place where humanity should have been had been removed from the structure of reality. The fleet advanced cautiously, sensors sweeping the region, searching for any trace of the target. They found something, not a structure, not a signal, a presence, subtle, everywhere. The same distortion that had once existed as isolated nodes now permeated the entire system, no longer localized, no longer contained. This wasn't the center of the network. It was the network. The realization hit too late. "We're already inside it," the commander said, their voice barely more than a whisper. Across the fleet, systems began to respond. Not failing, not shutting down, but behaving differently. Commands executed before they were issued. Movements occurred without clear initiation. The boundary between action and intention began to blur. The network wasn't resisting them. It was including them. Back in the observation chamber, the analyst felt the shift ripple outward, the data streams aligning into something new, something far more complete than before. "They didn't build a weapon," they said slowly. "They built a condition." The words hung in the air. Because a weapon could be destroyed, a condition could not. Across the galaxy, the contradictions deepened, the inconsistencies spreading, the very concept of a fixed outcome beginning to dissolve. And for the first time, a question emerged that no strategy, no fleet, no empire could answer. If humanity has turned reality itself into something that cannot agree on what happens, then how do you win a war where victory cannot exist? The moment the galaxy understood it could not win, it did what it had always done. It tried to restore control. Across every major power, emergency doctrines activated simultaneously, protocols designed for existential collapse, scenarios where logic failed and survival demanded immediate, decisive action. Fleets were recalled, borders sealed, communication networks isolated from one another in an attempt to preserve internal consistency. If reality could not be trusted, then it would be reduced, simplified, contained within smaller, more manageable systems. At first, it seemed to work. Localized regions stabilized as connections to the wider network were severed. Time aligned. Signals behaved predictably. Outcomes returned to singular, reliable states. For a brief moment, the illusion of control reappeared. Then the contradictions came back, not from outside, from within. A ship that had remained isolated began to report duplicate readings, Two identical sensor sweeps, both valid, both slightly different. A commander issued an order and watched it execute correctly and incorrectly in the same moment. Entire systems that had been cut off from the spreading distortion began to generate inconsistencies without any external trigger. The network had already reached them, not physically, conceptually. You can't isolate from something that isn't traveling, the analyst said, their voice hollow with realization. It doesn't spread like a signal. It changes the rules everywhere at once. The room went still, because that meant there was no edge to retreat behind, no boundary to defend, no safe zone left. The galaxy had entered the condition. Across the attacking empire, panic broke through discipline. The realization spread faster than any command could contain. There was no countermeasure, no strategic repositioning, no technological advantage that could restore the old rules, because the old rules were gone, and the new ones weren't finished. The contradictions were still increasing, still evolving, still unstable. What happens when it completes? One of the commanders asked, the question slipping out before it could be restrained. No one answered, because no one knew. The analyst stared at the data, at the cascading inconsistencies that now defined every system they monitored, and for the first time, a different kind of fear took hold. Not fear of the attackers, not fear of humanity, fear of what humanity might have become, because the pattern was shifting again. The contradictions were no longer random. They were converging. Small inconsistencies began to align into larger structures, patterns forming within the chaos that suggested something more than simple disruption. Events didn't just contradict each other. They began to influence each other across different outcomes, as if multiple versions of reality were interacting, blending, collapsing, reforming. It's stabilizing, the analyst whispered. The words sent a ripple of unease through the chamber. That's not possible, someone replied. It's designed to remove stability. It was, the analyst said. A pause. Now it's becoming something else. The projection shifted, pulling together data from across the galaxy into a single, unified display. For the first time, the full scope of the transformation became visible, not as isolated distortions, not as expanding anomalies, but as a single, cohesive state. The network had completed, and it had done something no one had anticipated. It had found balance. The contradictions no longer spiraled out of control. They coexisted. Multiple outcomes remained possible, but they no longer conflicted. They overlapped, each one influencing the others without collapsing into a single, fixed result. Reality had not been broken. It had been expanded, and at the center of it all, something appeared. Not a structure, not a signal, a presence. It wasn't located in one place, nor could it be tracked across coordinates. It existed everywhere the network touched, a subtle awareness woven into the fabric of the new state. The analyst felt it before they understood it, a sense of observation, not hostile, not passive, aware. They're still here, they said, their voice barely audible. The others turned to them. Who? A commander asked. The analyst didn't look away from the projection. Humanity. The word carried a weight that silenced the room, because this wasn't survival as anyone understood it. There were no fleets, no planets, no centralized command, and yet the presence remained, integrated, distributed, unbound. They didn't just build the system, the analyst continued, the realization forming as they spoke. They became it. The implication hit instantly. Humanity had not hidden within the network. It had dissolved into it. Every contradiction, every inconsistency, every shifting outcome. They were not side effects. They were expressions of something that still thought, still decided, still existed. The attacking empire made one final attempt to respond. A desperate act, born not of strategy, but of refusal to accept the new reality. They targeted a region where the presence felt strongest, deploying everything they had left in a single, concentrated strike designed to force a resolution, to collapse the overlapping outcomes into a single final result. The weapons fired, the impact occurred, and for a brief moment, everything aligned. The contradictions vanished. The outcomes converged. Reality snapped into a single, definitive state. Victory, defeat, destruction, survival, all of it resolved. The galaxy held its breath, because this was the moment where the new system would either hold or break. The projection stabilized. The data cleared. The result became visible. And in that single final outcome, one truth emerged, so absolute, so unavoidable, that it echoed across every mind still capable of understanding it. The attack had succeeded, and it had changed nothing. The contradictions returned instantly, the overlapping realities reasserting themselves as if the resolved outcome had never been enough to define the whole. The presence remained, unaltered, unbroken, watching. The analyst leaned back, the weight of the realization settling fully for the first time. You can't end something that doesn't need to be one thing, they said. A pause. And you can't defeat something that doesn't rely on a single outcome to survive. Silence followed, not uncertainty, finality, because the galaxy had just reached its breaking point and crossed it. The question that remained was no longer how to stop humanity. It was something far more unsettling. If humanity is no longer bound to a single reality, then what happens when it decides which one becomes real? The answer did not arrive as a declaration. It arrived as a choice. Not spoken, not broadcast, not enforced by fleets or weapons or systems anyone could track. It simply happened, and in happening, it rewrote the question itself. Across the galaxy, the overlapping contradictions, the multiple versions of events, the unstable outcomes, the fractured sequences, began to settle, not collapse, not disappear, but align, as if something was gently guiding them toward coherence without forcing them into it. Reality did not return to what it had been. It became something agreed upon, not by law, not by physics, by presence. The vast, unbound awareness that humanity had become moved through the network, not as a wave, not as a signal, but as intention. Where contradictions existed, they were not erased, but reconciled. Where outcomes diverged, they were not forced into one, but shaped into something that could exist without conflict. For the first time since the transformation began, the galaxy experienced something it had not known it had lost. Continuity. Ships moved again, without hesitation. Signals arrived without contradiction. Time flowed without disagreement. But beneath that restored stability, something remained. A difference. Subtle. Permanent. The analyst felt it immediately, even before the data confirmed it. The world still behaved as expected, but now it could have behaved differently, and that possibility never went away. Across the former territories of the attacking empire, the aftermath revealed itself not as destruction, but as absence. Their fleets were gone, not scattered, not retreating, but simply no longer present in any version of events that persisted. Their worlds remained, their structures intact, their populations reduced, not erased completely, but changed. The ones who had orchestrated the massacre, the ones who had turned suffering into spectacle, who had chosen humiliation as a weapon, they were gone in every outcome that remained stable, not killed, removed from the set of possibilities that continued. The galaxy understood the message instantly. This was not revenge. It was selection. The human presence had not chosen to destroy everything. It had chosen what would continue. In the central chambers of what remained of galactic leadership, silence held. Not the fearful silence of uncertainty, but the heavy stillness of understanding something too large to respond to. The analyst stood among them, no longer just an observer, but a witness to something that had reshaped existence itself. "They didn't punish us," someone said quietly. The analyst shook their head. "No." A pause. "They decided what kind of galaxy gets to exist." The words settled, final and undeniable, because the transformation had not been about power. It had been about consequence, across human space, if it could still be called that. There were no fleets returning, no governments reasserting control, no leaders stepping forward to claim victory. There was no need. Humanity was everywhere the network had touched, and nowhere it could be targeted. They had not conquered the galaxy. They had become part of the condition that allowed it to function, the arbiter of outcomes, the quiet force behind continuity, the unseen boundary between what was possible and what was permitted. The analyst turned back to the projection one last time, watching as the final inconsistencies resolved into stable patterns, the network no longer expanding, no longer changing, simply present. A thought formed, one that had lingered since the moment the transformation began. "Can they undo it?" someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The analyst considered the question, looked at the data, felt the presence that still lingered at the edge of perception, calm, aware, unthreatening, but absolute. Then they answered, "Why would they?" A pause. "Everything they wanted is already here." The chamber fell silent again, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant. Because humanity had not asked for dominance. It had not demanded obedience. It had not imposed control through force. It had simply ensured that what happened to them would never happen again, not because others feared retaliation, but because in this new reality, the outcome where it could happen no longer existed. And as the galaxy continued stable, continuous, untouched by contradiction, the final realization settled into every mind that understood what had changed. Humanity had not won the war. It had ended the possibility of losing, and in doing so, it had proven something no species had ever imagined could be true. The ultimate power was not the ability to destroy your enemy. It was the ability to decide which realities are allowed to survive